Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. After clearing the first 7 bosses on Mythic and now I'm in Tendril Prison, I wanted to go over some advanced tips and tricks that I've discovered over the course of going through the Amirdrassil raid, specifically playing with a Mindbender heavy setup. This is the build that I advised you guys to run in the initial disc raid video for the patch. It's the default build. I have a Shadow Fiend and Uppies build and everything like that, also on Wowhead, but I primarily recommend people run with the Mindbender to get started. And after doing it for the first 7 bosses, I want to add some more tips to the equation. So with this, we're going to focus on both Nimue and Smolderon, but these tips will also work for all of these boss encounters. The main reason I want to focus on these 2 encounters is because there's a lot of times where you have to kind of go off the beaten track when it comes to executing with Mindbender. Biggest thing, of course, as a sort of refresher, the whole idea of what you want to execute on this setup is every 30 seconds, you're going to have whatever individual atonements you can apply, and double radiance, Mindbender, and then start pounding damage. You'll be using your Rapture and Evangelism together. The next time around, you get your double radiance charges, use Rapture, apply atonements that way, hit your double radiance, hit Evangelism, hit your Bender, and then go to town doing damage, producing all the healing. So the timing of when you're using your Rapture and Evangelism can vary a little bit. I know on Smolderon, I'm using it on like the very first ramp sequence, while our other Disc Priest is using it on the other brand of Damnation, the other Absorb that goes out into the raid, and so we alternate. I'll have a strong ramp, and he'll have a weak ramp, and then he'll have his strong ramp, and I'll have my weak ramp. We just alternate back and forth, which still allows us to get our Mindbenders up for the intermission, so when we have healing to do in the intermission, we'll also have our little squid friend to be able to help us along the equation. So, first things first, the beaten track is one of the most important things, but it's not something that's always perfect. On Nimue, you're having, of course, to dodge in and out of the group. You're also having to be in different sizes of groups as well. So one of the first things I noticed when I was progressing on this encounter is that you want to make sure you're never wasting any radiance charges, but you're not always able to perfectly play around using both radiance charges together. Specifically in the intermission phase where you're having to heal with the add alone, there's times where you may not need to rip both of your radiance charges, and you can just kind of pool one, and then you have it back that much faster for the intermission as it comes around. There's also moments when how you aim your radiances and how you apply your atonements is really, really important on both these encounters. So on Nimue, you're going to have usually the Disc Priest in the middle of the room, while you're having other ranged players onto your left and right to soak up some of those flowers. And so you need to make sure your individual atonements are being cast on those players, because when you cast Radiance on melee or on yourself or other healers that are concentrated in the middle of the room, Radiance is only going to apply atonements to allies within 30 yards of your target, which means that you may potentially not hit some of those farther standing range players if you radianced off of yourself, which means they don't receive any healing for your ramp. You're having a 17 or 18 person evangelism instead of a 19 or 20 person evangelism, which is losing out on extra output. And so making that mental note of where everybody's standing, whether it's Nimue, Smolderon, Laradar, whatever the fights, always is going to be of prime importance for when you individually apply atonements and who you radiance on. A good thing I like to keep in mind on all those encounters is to primarily be casting radiances off of melee and off of myself or another of the healers that I know is more centrally located. We had either like our Mistweaver, who is also in melee. Other times I'd cast it off the other Disc Priest because I'm using the Binding Heals talent, which is also applying atonement to myself when I cast Flash Heal. But if I know the other disc is situated in a similar position, or you have like a Resto Shaman, Preservation Evoker, something along those lines, whereas they're going to try to be central as best as they possibly can, that makes things substantially easier, just that you know not to apply individual atonements to that person, but to cast radiance off of them, because they're often in a ideal location to be able to cast off of. When it's on Smolderon, I'll try to individually apply atonements to range players, and then I'll try to cast radiances off of melee players in the tanks, since players are stacking on the tanks for the brand of Damnation, which would mean whether it's my primary ramp or my mini ramps, I will always prefer or have a greater likelihood of applying atonements to allies that are receiving that absorb effect. It's not perfect, it's not bulletproof, but you have to do whatever you can to sort of push those odds better in your favor to prioritize the right targets to be able to heal. Also, if you're enjoying the content, make sure to subscribe and consider hitting the join button or checking out our Patreon if you'd like to support further. Now, there's another challenge that a lot of people are running into with Mindbender right now, and it has to do with cooldown reduction. Keep in mind, when you are using Mindbender, you are casting, of course, your Penance, your Smite, your Mind Blast, and they're all reducing the cooldown of your Mindbender. When you're in Shadow Covenant, Smites are hitting twice thanks to your 4-set bonus, which also means they give you additional cooldown reduction for Void Summoner, which is for your Mindbender, and also for Train of Thought, which is for your Penance. So your Penance comes back faster, and your Mindbender comes back faster as well. Biggest challenge I see with guilds who are progressing on Smolderon is that their Disc Priests are struggling to get enough cooldown reduction to get their Mindbender back on this 30-second cycle. It's a very harsh cycle to make sure you're casting enough of these smites, particularly when you have to maneuver around and you have to be running all over the room, making sure you're dodging flame waves and dodging other people's circles, all of those kind of things. And so it makes it substantially easier is that when you hit your primary output, when you hit your Mind Blast into your Penance, and then you're able to continue on with Halo, Shadow or Death, all that stuff. That's great. After that, though, after you hit your Mind Blast, your Penance, your Shadow or Death, your Halo, and a couple Smites, you are then in a position where you're still in Shadow Covenant and still have your pet out, but the brunt of your burst AoE healing has kind of been delivered to the targets, which is great. That is the area where you need to play most efficiently around your cooldown reduction. So once you have sort of completed that point where you still have the opportunity to farm up more cooldown reduction, that is where you need to sit still and start tunneling smites so that you're going to be able to farm up your next Mindbender, even if it means you're kind of not really producing any healing for a brief period of time. You'll see it on Smolderon as I'm trying to farm up my Mindbender to get ready for the intermission. Or you'll see it if I can find an ideal position to sit myself down and then just start chaining together those smites. It also means that your second Penance and your second Shadow or Death during your Shadow Covenant duration, you may not want to hit right away because you might have to be moving a little bit later on. Same thing goes for Nimue as well, where that second Penance, that second Shadow or Death that you could cast over the duration of your Shadow Covenant, it might be better to just slam smites until you have to move to get out of the way of the cutter beams on Nimue or flame waves on Smolderon, so that every single GCD you are casting something that's benefiting, the team, and you're also still maximizing the smites that you're producing so that you can get the maximum cooldown reduction for your pet and you can have it back on the next 30-second cycle. And with this, it makes a substantial difference in your terms of your overall output. I see it a lot with Smolderon progression logs and everything like that, where, there is a lot to dodge, there is a lot to run around and do. And so the more that you're able to sort of give yourself extra space to be able to fully farm up the next wave of your Mindbender and save some instant cast spells for when you have to run around the room, the easier it gets. It's really good if you get Spatial Paradox, which is the movement casting from an Augmentation Evoker. I have not had that on any of my progression kills at the moment. I probably will have it for Tindril, as we're still progressing on that boss and probably will be for quite a while. But it's not mandatory to have, but it's certainly an excellent benefit to be able to utilize and have at your disposal. It's something to keep in mind that can be utilized sort of in your toolbox. Other abilities, things like Pain Suppression, are great to be able to use onto yourself. And what I also found on Smolderon in particular was if you have some amount of damage reduction, and especially if the boss is not receiving any orbs, I was honestly using my defensive, my Desperate Prayer, which I was spec'd into to maximize my health, more so when I was dropping Flame Waves. Especially if people are kind of being terrorists about how they're dropping Flame Waves. It's a lot easier if you're able to use your defensive there in case you're standing next to somebody who aims their flame wave right at you and you have, a fraction of a second of time to be able to react, and sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. So it's easier if you already have that defensive on hand to help keep you alive, if you, of course, know that you're going to be able to survive the Brand of Damnation, because that also does increase in damage over the course of the encounter. So think about those things. Overall, the more you're able to consistently farm up Bender and have it available in advance of the damage, larger of a difference in your overall output you'll have. Also, it's important to keep in mind that Penance is a projectile. And you might think, well, duh. But what this really means is that when you are preparing your double Harsh Discipline, Dark Reprimand, Massive Chunker Penance, you can actually cast it earlier than you think, because it does take time for penance to actually get into the target, and it takes time for the full 8 bolts to be able to get to the target as well. And so the more that you think about that sort of positioning of where your character is, how much time it takes your bolts to actually deliver onto the target, the faster you can start clearing out some of those healing debuffs on things like Smolderon, the faster you can reverse incoming damage on other fights like Nimue, Laradar, all of the higher HPS check encounters in this raid, and the easier of a time that you're going to be able to have in general. A lot of these examples also can be extrapolated, of course, for a Mythic Plus environment, where farming up more Bender uptime is, of course, giving you lots of AoE damage, but it also nets you a greater level of safety for healing up really intense moments throughout the dungeons, throughout boss fights, you name it. So keep these things in mind. I hope these tips helped, and let me know if you have any other questions or anything else that you'd be looking for Disc, Holy, whichever, as we're continuing on with Amirdrassil and Season 3. Make sure to subscribe as well, as it does help our channel out quite a lot. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Hope y'all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.